The Art of Hiding by Pink Palace Apartments. Summary: 5 times Sirius almost got James and Regulus, and 1 time he did. 1. James wasn't a great liar, for all that he tried. Remus would probably say that was why they got caught during their pranks so often, and would probably be right. He nearly always was, the damn bastard. This being said, dating Regulus Black was the easiest and most difficult thing he had ever done. Easy because Regulus made him feel at ease in a way that he'd never known he could. There was a lightness that filled his body when Regulus was around that he had yet to find anywhere else. His mom would probably say that it was love, and she would probably be right. She nearly always was. It was difficult because it was a secret, and though James really, really loved having Regulus all to himself, it did complicate things a bit. Namely, when, where, and how they could meet up. There was also the issue of Sirius, who probably wouldn't be incredibly pleased to know that James was dating his brother in secret. Partly because James and Sirius didn't do secrets, and partly because Sirius was extremely protective of both of them. They were going to tell him at some point, really, they were. They had to, if they expected things between them to last, but the prospect was terrifying enough that they both agreed to keep things on the low until they could figure out how exactly to reveal that they were together. Regulus was an excellent liar, which sort of turned James on, if he was being honest. It shouldn't have. James didn't really value dishonesty as a character trait, but there was something incredibly sexy about Regulus lying to people right to their face and never raising a single doubt. Still, Regulus couldn't carry their secrets on his back, though he'd been doing his best to. James had already failed miserably at convincing some of his friends he wasn't seeing anyone. So now he was just trying to keep his head above the water enough to make sure they didn't find out who he was seeing. Sirius, thankfully, was not part of this group, because he certainly wouldn't have stopped until he found out every detail. As far as the others were concerned, there were enough students at Hogwarts that they wouldn't figure out right away, but not enough that they wouldn't figure out eventually. Lily had already figured it out, actually, when they'd stumbled upon each other in equally compromising situations with a secret partner. James and Lily had shared indignant remarks while Regulus and Mary had exchanged terse nods of unspoken alliance, and none of them had addressed it since. James didn't mind Lily knowing, though, because she was a better liar than he was, and if it came to it, and he couldn't convince the rest of her friends he wasn't seeing anyone particularly interested to them, she could. Plus, Mary was an unexpected great ally, because she was a master at changing the subject, especially where Sirius was concerned. James and Regulus made a habit of meeting in the Quidditch changing rooms, because they tended to go unbothered after all the practices were over for the day. Most couples went to the astronomy tower or an abandoned classroom, though the changing rooms were really rather suited for a hearty snog. One afternoon, James mentioned this to Regulus, and Regulus gagged as he pulled away from James. "Please tell me you did not just say the words hearty snog out loud," Regulus said, aghast. "You know what's embarrassing?" James asked, ignoring Regulus's expression. The fact that I can say hearty snog and you're still turned on." Regulus' mouth dropped open, then shut it as quickly, his pale face going bright red. James really loved nothing more than make him blush like that, if only because he knew Regulus would find a way to make him blush just as deeply in revenge. In the meantime, though, Regulus just tipped his head back, curls falling away from his face, and bit his lip, very clearly trying not to give James the satisfaction of being right. James trailed a finger along his Adam's apple, enjoying how Regulus's fingers tightened around his arm. Regulus returned his gaze to James, grey eyes dark and depthless as the night, and James met him with a smile he reserved only for him. James had a lot of smiles, and no one really saw him going anywhere without one, but Regulus was the only person that got to see this one. "You're annoying," Regulus said. "And you love it," James said. Regulus ran his hands up the sides of James's arms, bringing them to rest at the base of his neck, tangling in the ends of his messy hair. James settles his own hands on Regulus's waist, liking, as always, how his slender and sharp frame felt within his grasp. "I do," Regulus said. James grinned as he tipped his head down for a kiss. Regulus wasn't all that much shorter than he was, but he liked the few inches that he had on him. He felt like he could protect him better, curl Regulus in his arms and never let him go. Regulus pretended to be annoyed by it, but James knew he liked it too. No one had ever cared for him the way James did, and though it made James's heart break, he was honored to give him that kind of love and care. As always, their kisses turned from soft to passionate in a blink of an eye. Off went their shirts, and then James and Regulus pressed against the locker. Regulus's legs wrapped around his waist, and it was perfect. Perfect. That is, until the door slammed open, and James did the only thing he could think to do, and turned into a stag. Thank Merlin, Regulus already knew that he was an animagus, otherwise this plan would have been even worse than it already was. Regulus sent him a pleading stare before turning to see who'd interrupted them and freezing where he stood. James, as a stag, did the same. Sirius obviously recognized James in stag form, but he would never assume Regulus did. Slowly, he asked, "Hey, Reg, what you got there?" Regulus ignored James entirely and grabbed his Quidditch jersey from where James had thrown it on the bench. "Jersey?" he said, lifting it up. Sirius blinked. I sort of meant deer." "Oh," Regulus said, looking at James in surprise like he was just noticing him. "I think it's a stag." James couldn't drop his head in his hands, so he settled for poking Regulus with one of his antlers. Regulus shot him a glare, and Sirius looked like he was about to burst into laughter. Well, at least he'd believed James when he told Sirius it was some sort of prank later. "What is a stag doing in here?" Sirius asked. "Maybe it wants to play Quidditch," Regulus said dumbly, and James took back everything he'd ever said about Regulus being a good liar. Sirius narrowed his eyes. "How do you know it's a he?" "Females aren't called stags, and they don't have antlers. You'd know that if you studied for once in your life." Regulus crossed his arms, raising his eyebrows. "The study session you spend with Remus once a week doesn't count, because I know damn well that you two are not studying." Jesus Christ, black brothers are so easy to rile up. Sirius blushed just as furiously as Regulus had minutes before, but he didn't look embarrassed by it. James was always a bit wary when Regulus and Sirius interacted, not because he was worried about Sirius finding out about him and Reg, but because he never knew what would send their recently mended relationship back into a tailspin. It was a whole thing that Sirius had run away to James' family back in 5th year, and Regulus hadn't come with him. According to Sirius, it was because Regulus refused to come, and according to Regulus, it was because Sirius hadn't asked him. They hadn't spoken for months afterwards, until Walburga and Orion were sent to Azkaban for generalized awfulness or something. James didn't particularly care about the details, and Regulus had moved in with their cousin Andromeda and her husband Ted until he came of age. James and Regulus, who used to be sort of friends but had distanced quite a bit when things got tense with Sirius and Regulus, had started to get close again in the period of time immediately following, and James had encouraged Regulus to reach out to his brother. He had said the same thing to Sirius as well, but it hadn't happened until Andromeda had particularly forced a family reunion during winter holiday that year. Andromeda, Ted, and their daughter Nymphadora and Regulus had spent Christmas with the Potters and Sirius, and surprisingly, things had mended. James and Regulus had also kissed for the first time during that break, and the second, and the third, and so on. But it hadn't seemed right to say anything to Sirius at that time, with his and Regulus's relationship so precautiously on the mend, and now, 4 months later, they still hadn't found the right moment. This, obviously, was also not the right moment. Sirius didn't get mad at Regulus's jibe, though, and flicked his hair off his shoulder. No need to be jealous because I'm getting someone and you're not. Maybe I am, Regulus said indignantly. I just don't get all star-eyed about it. James, as a stag, snorted, because he knew that Regulus got very star-eyed indeed. It was honestly a shock. No one had noticed it, but that was probably because they weren't looking. Regulus Black in love with a Gryffindor nonetheless? Blasphemy. Sirius' eyes flicked to James, but then he asked anyway. Wait, really? Who are you shagging? Why didn't you tell me? Ugh, don't say it's Crouch. Regulus rolled his eyes. I'm not shagging anyone. Calm down. I'm just saying that I could be. Sirius' excitement deflated. Oh, well, I guess I'll leave you to it. Do you need a stag, or can I borrow him? Why on earth would I need a stag? Regulus asked, quite convincingly. Good liar cred resorted. Frank, Sirius said with a shrug. So, all yours, Regulus said, pulling a jumper over his head and turning towards his locker. James didn't miss the soft smile he sent his way before he did, though. If he hadn't been a stag at that moment, James would have sent one back. All right, then. Come on, you, he said to James, patting his leg excitedly, luring him like a puppy. It would have been funnier to be stubborn about it, but James didn't really want Stubborn to question anything further, so he went with him willingly, sending one last look behind him as he went. Love swelling in his chest at the sight of Regulus, doubled over laughing silently behind his locker. 2. After the changing room incident, Regulus and James had been more careful about, at the very least, keeping the map near them when they were together. The Forbidden Forest had in some ways become their sanctuary, despite the centaurs threatening them whenever they ran into them. On a Hogsmeade Saturday, however, James and Regulus found themselves up in the Marauders' dorm under the guise of James helping Reg study for his owls. Instead, Regulus was laying on top of James, and James was playing with his hair, and they were settled into their bliss. Remus and Sirius were on a date, he thought, and Peter had been stolen away by the girls for something or other, which meant pretty much that they had the whole day to themselves. It had been far too long since they had been anything of the sort. Jamie, Regulus mumbled sleepily. James bit the insides of his cheek. Knowing Regulus could probably hear just how much his heart rate picked up at the nickname. His parents had called him Jamie when he was little, but hadn't for many years, and the Marauders never had, but James mentioned liking the nickname once in passing, long before he and Regulus had even kissed, and Regulus still used it sparingly. But when he did, it felt like he might explode with love. "Yes," he replied, shifting his own head so he could look Regulus in the eyes. Regulus, however, was avoiding his gaze. "I have to tell you, well, I don't have to. I want to, I suppose." "You've lost me," Regulus said James said with a half laugh, with a small laugh. Regulus grumbled, burying his head deeper into James's chest. He kept talking, but James couldn't make out what he was saying in the slightest. He gently slid Regulus off of him and settled their bodies side by side, close enough that they were still tangled together, noses touching, but so Regulus couldn't hide himself away. "What is it?" James asked softly. Regulus was red in the face, looking vaguely uncomfortable and embarrassed, but James had no idea why. He was silent for a long breath, in and out, and then he fixed those coracle eyes on James, eyelashes long and inky black, just like the grown-out hair and that framed his face. James had made a point of mentioning how much he loved Regulus's hair when it was longer and a bit unruly, and Regulus hadn't cut it since then. "I love you," Regulus said quietly. So quietly, in fact, that James, still distracted by the eyelashes, couldn't hear it. He saw panic fill Regulus's eyes and realized that he must have missed something important. What?" he asked. Regulus's whole body was tense at this point, and James began to worry about what he had said, but then he repeated, "I love you," a bit louder, and James melted, thinking that this would be remembered as one of the best moments in his life. His face split into a wide grin, and he pressed their foreheads together, noses squishing. "I love you too," he said, with no hesitation, because it was something he'd felt for longer than Regulus probably realized. He hadn't said it because he hadn't wanted to rush things or scare Regulus away, but now he could. Oh man, he'd be saying it every minute of every day. Some of the panic subsided from Regulus's eyes. "You do?" "The heart of a lion," James said. "That's what your star is, and that's what you are to me. You're my whole heart, Reg." Regulus smiled slowly and let James peck him swiftly on the lips. "You love me," James said giddily. "Regulus Black loves me." "Don't be so surprised, as if I could love anyone else," Regulus said, punctuated with an eye roll like it wasn't the sweetest sentiment in the world. Because the moment was so blissful, so amazing, naturally the doorknob jiggled. James was very glad he had the foresight to lock it, but was startled regardless. "Oi, Bronx, why'd you lock the door?" came Sirius's voice on the other side. They probably had about 30 seconds before Sirius remembered he was a wizard and could easily unlock the door, so James unceremoniously shoved Regulus off the bed. Regulus sputtered quietly as James apologized. "Sorry, I love you. Came hide under the bed." "I thought you said they'd be gone all day," Regulus hissed. "They were supposed to." Sirius knocked again. "Are you having a wank? Use the bathroom like the rest of us." "Merlin Pats, I'm coming," James said, haphazardly throwing a shirt on, trying not to look like he'd spent all day in bed with someone. Regulus shot a hand out from under the bed, middle finger raised, as James bent down to kiss it before heading to the door. Sirius and Remus were arm in arm, and while Sirius looked him up and down slyly, Remus looked suspicious. Remus was the one who'd pierced together that James was seeing someone, but he knew Remus wouldn't say anything about it until he had all the details, which James did not intend on providing. "I was napping," James lied. "Not so bad. Maybe Regulus was rubbing off on him." "I thought you had studying to do," Remus asked. "Why do you think I was napping?" James joked, sitting down the edge of his bed. Regulus poked his ankle. I thought you were on a date. Sirius snorted. We were. We were gone for 5 hours. Really? I've been asleep for a long time, James said, feigning surprise. Remus snorted derisively, but Remus didn't seem to notice. Well, anyway, it's time for dinner. You coming? Sirius asked, rifling through his trunk for one of the many jumpers he'd stolen from Remus. James hopped up, stopping Regulus from prodding at his ankles. Sure thing, you two go on, though I should probably brush my teeth. I have sleep breath. Ugh, gross, Sirius said, throwing on a jumper and grabbing Remus's hand, pulling him out of the door. James waited until he heard footsteps fade down the stairs, then hopped back up on his bed, peeking his head down to see Regulus's grumpy face underneath it. I love you, he said cheerfully. Yeah, Regulus said, though his face softened. He shifted forwards to kiss James, and James accidentally flipped off his bed in excitement. Regulus crawled out from under the bed, looking like a cute disaster. He held out a hand to help James up. You're ridiculous. And you're Regulus, James said. Regulus pushed him onto the next bed over, which happened to belong to Sirius. Before James could say anything, Regulus was leaning over and kissing him into the mattress. I fucking knew it, said a tired voice from the doorway, and James and Regulus poked their heads in that direction, surprise and panic. Remus leaned against the doorframe, rubbing his temples. Carry on, he said. Just get to dinner before Padfoot gets separation anxiety. Aye, Captain, James said, and Remus left the room, shutting the door behind him. He won't tell, Regulus worried, but James shook his head. Regulus sighed in relief, and then started to laugh. We're awful at this, aren't we? Yeah, James admitted. But you love me. What does that have to do with anything? Nothing, James shrugged. Just like a reminder. Regulus grinned. Go to dinner. I love you, James said. Yeah, I love you too. 3. The abandoned girls' bathroom was nothing if not good for a clandestine snog. About a week after their close shave in the dorm, Regulus and James had refrained from meeting up for any extended period of time, but still stole as many small moments as they could, including now during James's history of magic class and Regulus's free period. Their ties had discarded and their robes were on the ground, shirts unbuttoned, at least 3 buttons more than was decent. You can't keep skiving off class if you want to pass your exams, Regulus said, his breath hot on James's neck. Can this conversation happen when we're not snogging? James asked. He shivered as Regulus placed 3 kisses along his jawline. I'm just saying, Regulus said. James brushed a thumb across Regulus's cheekbones, separating their faces enough to give him a knowing grin. You'd rather I was in Bin's class right now, Regulus rolls his eyes. I didn't say that. I know everything anyway, James assured him. He probably didn't know as much as Regulus, who literally knew everything about everything, but he was one of the best students in his year, only behind Lily and Sirius, who were actually geniuses in the same way Reg was. Only difference was that Lily studied like it was breathing, and Sirius had never studied once in his life. Remus could beat James too, most times, but he'd laid off trying to be the best once he realized it wouldn't matter much anyway, giving his furry little brother problem. James resented this notion, but Remus attuned his genius to planning their pranks now, which James and Sirius agreed was much better use of time. Do you know who led the 18th century Goblin Revolution? Regulus asked. Ugh, the unclean baby, James answered, pulling him back in for a kiss. Regulus giggled into it. Oh, what a heavenly sound was that, and said, I do love it when you talk dirty to me. If only everyone knew what an absolute dork you are, James said dreamily against Regulus's lips. Regulus mumbled something back that sounded a bit like Gryffindor, but James kissed him through it before Regulus could try and distract him with driving again. Though maybe he should suggest some sort of raunchy study game. It seemed to work for Remus and Sirius in any case. Regulus was a dork, though. He was quite witty. He was quite witty. This much most everyone who spoke to him knew, and he used a lot of big words in long sentences, and he rarely smiled, and he had the most upright posture James had ever seen, and that was regular, and that was Regulus Black, certainly, but it wasn't the only side to him. The side James knew made horrible jokes, but though they were extremely funny, giggled instead of outright laughing, and had the tendency of dropping his wand when he performed a spell, and had incredibly developed an affinity for wandless magic because of it. Had never once used the prefix bathroom because he hated baths and was afraid of drowning, and loved harder than anyone James had ever known, Sirius included. Regulus actually said little in general, though he spoke the most when he was with James. With that only meant he chose his words more carefully than anyone else. James often got the sense that they were 12 different conversations happening inside Regulus's head at once, and he took his time to carefully craft responses for each of them. James, whose mom had told him to think before he acts more times than he could count, could very much not relate. James thought it made them work, though. They were like fire and ice. Sure, they might work fine separately, but didn't the excitement come from them being mixed together? James was never worried about Regulus's eyes, and Regulus had finally stopped worrying about being burned. James wrapped his arms around Regulus's thighs and hoisted him up onto the sink, determined to do nothing but kiss the ever-loving shit out of this incredibly boy of his for as long as humanly possible, which, of course, wasn't long. Minutes later, could have been an hour, really, but to James it felt like a blink of an eye. Regulus tucked the collar of James's shirt and pulled back from the embrace. "I have to go," he said. "Charms." "Boo," James said, artificially. As compelling as that argument was, Regulus said, lazily waving his hands. His robes and his tie were summoned in a hand in an instant. James stubbornly stayed where he was, one hand on Regulus's thigh, doing his best impression of Sirius's patented puppy dog eyes. Regulus picked up James's discarded uniform items and held it out to him. Valiant effort, truly. "You can skip one measly little charms class," James whined. "How would I explain that absence? Apologies, Flitwick. I was busy snogging my golden boy. I'm sure you'd understand." Regulus deadpanned. James raised his eyebrows appreciatively. "Honestly, I think all Flitwick would respect it." Regulus shoved James a nudge with a nudge of his foot. "Wait," James continued. "Your golden boy?" The tips of Regulus's ears went pink, but he held his ground. He hopped off the counter and took James's tie from his hand, doing it up more swiftly than James had ever seen it. Regulus Black, everyone, annoyingly good at everything, even when he wasn't trying to be. "Aren't you?" he asked. "Mine?" James wanted to taste the words on his tongue. Before he could make a move, though, Regulus stalked out of the bathroom without another word, likely grinning to himself while also steadying his rapid heartbeat. James whispered, "Fuck," to himself, and splashed cold water on his face. Twice. He finished buttoning up his shirt and threw his robes on. Deciding to skip glancing in a mirror, He knew he had a distinct look of someone who had been thoroughly stalked, and he didn't care. No one had to know it was Regulus, but James liked the idea of people looking at him and seeing Regulus all over him. Lily would roll her eyes, and the marauders would have questions, but James was too love-struck to be a bad liar at the moment. He waited a few minutes before following Regulus out, though the map had told him no one was around. He did it as a courtesy, just in case. And because strolling into a transfiguration fashionably late was simply a part of his daily routine. Sirius nodded at him when he showed up, lost in conversation with Peter about something James was sure he'd hear about later. Remus was laid up in the post-moon hospital wing, which was probably for the best because he didn't need to see Remus's look of disapproval at the wrinkled state of his shirt and his messed up hair. Remus had remained mum about about the whole situation, not even bothering to inquire about it further with James on his own, though he surely wanted to. Maybe he was waiting for James to come to him. He probably should have right after Remus caught the two of them. But for now, he'd let it lie. No reason to have Remus talk sense to him about telling Sirius when he was doing such a good job of avoiding the topic so far. James slept into a seat next to beside Marlene, since Sirius and Peter were still talking and Mary and Lily were sitting together. She gave him a smile in greeting, then did a sharp double take. Damn, Regulus must have really messed him up good. Why are you... She trailed off, then shook her head. His brows furrowed. What the bloody hell have you got that tie on for? Sirius asked, finally turning around towards him. Had Regulus messed him up, messed up tying it so properly? He was about to ask what Sirius meant by that when he glanced down and oh shit. How had neither of them realized they were wearing each other's ties? James blinked, like that would magically correct it, but no. Where the red and gold usually sat was a silver and green. It smelled like him too. Oh God, was Sirius going to be able to smell it and figure it out? You were wearing the tie right before you did. You were wearing the right type right before you ditched us in history. Peter noted unhelpfully. You're right, Sirius agreed, cocking his head to the side. Prank? James said, and Marlene snorted at his side. She didn't know, but James had a feeling she knew something. He gave her a swift kick under the table. He wasn't the only one dating a Slytherin. After all, everyone knew about her and Dorcas Meadowlands. Sirius considers him. I'd believe you if you didn't look like someone fucked the life out of you. Kudos, Regulus. All they had done was kiss. Your secret girlfriend is a Slytherin? Peter gasped loudly. I don't have a secret girlfriend, James said, words coming easily because technically he wasn't lying. Marlene snorted again. Okay, she definitely knew too. Blimey, did everyone? Except Sirius and Peter, apparently. James didn't really care in all honesty. He sometimes thought he wanted the entire world to know, but he would keep things low-key as long as Regulus needed. They didn't have to shout everything from the rooftops, even if that was James's go-to. James could be good too. Or boyfriend, Sirius said, and narrowed his eyes. You've got me, James said with an exaggerated sigh. I'm sleeping with Snivelus. The suspicion on Sirius's face cleared in an instant. Wanker? How'd you know my pet name for him? Sirius and James cooed, and Sirius and Peter crowded with laughter. McGonagall from the front room swished her wand to shut them up. James was so used to it by this point that he took advantage of the silence to shout, "I'm in love with Regulus Black." Nothing came out except for air, as per usual, with the silencing charm. But James smiled to himself regardless. He ran this silty tie through his fingers and resisted the urge to bring it up to his nose once more, inhaling the scent that embedded himself into his pillows, his jumpers, his bones. Sirius had never asked if he was using a new shampoo, for all that he and Regulus smelled like one another these days. I will be scouring the Slytherin table for a Gryffindor tie, just so you know, Sirius wrote on a piece of paper and slipped it to him. Best of luck, James wrote back. He knew Regulus wouldn't be so stupid to wear the tie to dinner, but he hoped he kept it, and that he couldn't get enough of the scent either. He's going to fucking kill you, Marlene mumbled to him under her breath as James felt the silencing spell wearing off. He wasn't sure if he meant Regulus or Sirius, but regardless of her intent, he smirked and said, "Cheers!" Later that night at dinner, which James had corrected his for, folding Regulus carefully into the drawer inside his bed, all the Slytherins were craning their neck towards the Gryffindor table, as the Gryffindors were doing the same. Regulus, tightless in his seat, met James's eyes across the hall and shook his head with something that looked like fondness. Sirius, oblivious to James's right, simply asked James to pass the pudding, not noticing that his brother was the only Slytherin without a tie. 4. Somehow, Regulus and James had convinced Sirius that they hated each other. It wasn't James's fault that he'd thrown the quaffle at Regulus during the Gryffindor versus Slytherin match, landing him a penalty. It was Regulus's fault for taunting him from across the pitch. It had been a thrown quaffle of love, but of course no one knew that, but the two of them. Regulus had started crying. He'd laughed so hard after the match, and yes, it was incredibly endearing, but it didn't soothe the sting of Slytherin beating them. Regulus was easily the most talented seeker James had ever seen, in his totally unbiased opinion. So, it had probably been a doomed match from the start, but Gryffindor had only lost by 10 points in the end, so at least James had pulled his weight for the rest of the way. Regulus had been quick to point out that if James had gone for a goal instead of throwing the quaffle at him, they might have won, which was very much not the encouragement he needed to hear. But coming from Regulus, it didn't sound so bad. Needless to say, Sirius had reamed James out later, once he'd gotten back to the common room. At first, he'd been extremely confused, having just spent the last hour making out with Regulus, but then he remembered and had to fight to retain a neutral expression. He had to say he thought it was sweet to see Sirius protective of Regulus again. They didn't hang out too much, but they tried for once a week if they could. And though Sirius and Regulus had both told James it was awkward as hell at first, things were getting better day by day. Sirius had offhandedly mentioned inviting Regulus to the next party they had, and Remus and James had met each other's shocked expressions over Sirius's head. James had expected Sirius's stern words to be the end of it, forgotten about in the morning, but Sirius surprised him by dragging him out of bed and down the great hall for breakfast, sitting him down, then going to drag Regulus over to their table as well. Regulus looked panicked, and James tried to convey that Sirius didn't know about them. He actually thought the opposite. Based on Regulus's darting eyes, he did a poor job. Prongs, apologize, Sirius said stubbornly. Lily and Remus, who were already sitting at the table together had their heads huddled together. James knew exactly what they were talking about, and he was unamused. Sirius, I was the one who Regulus started, and James cut him off before he could say anything damning. Threatening to throw the quaffle at me first, James said, widening his eyes for once more for effect. Regulus furrowed his brows, but followed James's lead. He's right. I just didn't think he'd have the balls to follow up on my threat. Very funny, Reg. It took every ounce of James' self-control not to make some sort of sex joke, because because he knew hiding their relationship would be a lost cause after that. Even Sirius wouldn't be. Even Sirius couldn't be that oblivious. To be fair, it wasn't actually trying to hit him, James said to Sirius. You don't have to pretend to save face, Potter. I know your aim is just that far, Regulus said. When he said Potter, he meant Jamie, and James heard it loud and clear. His smile was genuine, and he tried to morph it into something more like a smirk. I'd worry more about your teammate's aim. If you hadn't caught that snitch, the loss would have been embarrassingly bad. That much was true. Do I hear a compliment in there somewhere? Regulus asked. In your dreams. All right. Sirius had clapped his hand. Sirius clapped his hand. That's enough out of that. Quidditch is over for the season, so there's no reason to hate one another, right? I can have two brothers, and they can get along just fine. Maybe. James fixed Sirius with an unamused stare. This talk sounds similar. When did you become the character on Who Can Hate Who again? Prongs, Sirius warned. Fine. James raised his hands in surrender. Regulus, I don't hate you. Regulus hummed noncommittedly, and James scoffed. You could say you don't hate me. I could, Regulus agreed. Sirius threw up his hands. Ugh, this is bloody annoying. James didn't dare to point out the irony when Sirius and Regulus had both been incredibly annoying in their disdains for one another. If he wasn't going to be self-aware about it, good enough that he was going to taste his own medicine. Sirius grabbed one of each of their arms and placed them on the table. They were sitting across from one another, so their fingers ended up inches apart. James saw Regulus' hand twist, an infinitesimal gesture to reach out James' hand. James ached to do the same, close that gap. Surprisingly, Sirius had the same thought. With a flick of his hand, Regulus and James' wrists were tied together with a bright red feather. James's mind screamed to him about a red string of fate, but he kept that to himself. The fuck, Sirius? Regulus asked, sounding appropriately alarmed. Don't think I've forgotten about the holidays, Sirius said darkly. In James's defense, the event Sirius was referring to had been before he and Regulus had kissed, and he thought the idea was funny. He charmed the two of them wearing a big sweater that said, "This is our get-along shirt," and hadn't given them the counter curls until they'd gone to bed that night. It had been a hit when his parents and Andromeda and Ted as well. It had been a hit with his parents and Andromeda and Ted as well. Regulus hadn't spoken to him for a whole day afterwards, but it was sort of worth it. I have things to do. I can spend all day dragging him around. James snorted. Things to do. You're just going to be in the library and studying. Regulus glowered at him. Am I right, or am I right? Sirius turned out Regulus's complaints entirely, too satisfied with himself to notice James hadn't complained once. Remus had his head down on the table, which James thought was a bit dramatic. I'll do it on the end of the night, Sirius said. But in the meantime, maybe you should use the time together to get over your stupid Quidditch thing and behave like friends. Who told you we were friends? Regulus asked. Which you will be, because I say so, Sirius sighed. Look, I love you both. I really do, okay? I and I want to get a chance at a future I thought I'd never have, with both of you in my life. It would be helpful if you two could get along. That is all. Oh, fine, you sap, James said, planting a kiss on his cheek. Regulus rolled his eyes in what was probably jealousy rather than annoyance. But Sirius looked pleased, even as he pretended to bat James away. James continued. Only one problem. He lifted his arm, taking Regulus with him, and glanced down either end of the table, of which they were situated in the middle. How do you expect us to get out of here? You could shovel along your arms over the heads, Remus suggested. He looked caught between thinking this was the funniest thing in the world and wishing ill will on all three of them, which James was honestly used to. Lily stifled a giggle and added her own 2 cents. One of them could climb across the table, leap into each other's arms, that sort of thing. Absolutely not, Regulus said dryly. One of his fingers played with his slack line of string connecting them. James had no such qualms about climbing over the table, so he did, intentionally knocking over Sirius's pumpkin juice in the process. Nearly every eye in the great hall was on them, but no one was stupid enough to inquire about what the hell was going on. They'd learned a long time ago that the best to leave the marauders to their own devices. Regulus didn't look so pleased about being lumped in with their group, but it made James giddy in ways he couldn't describe. Where to? James asked breathlessly, plopping down beside Regulus. He locked their ankles together under the table and smiled slyly at the redness that rushed to Regulus's ears. Regulus used his free hand to untug his hair from behind them to cover them up, knowing exactly what James was grinning at. Since you suggested the library, Regulus said. Killjoy, I wanted to try flying around like this. How are you not dead yet? Things worth living for, James said, pressing their elbows together. Regulus stood abruptly, banging his knees into the table. If he felt any pain or embarrassment, he didn't show it. Let's see if you feel the same after 8 hours in the library. James allowed Regulus to pull him up from the table like a rag doll because he liked it when Regulus was in control and stumbled along behind him as Regulus strode away from the table without another word. Don't kill each other, please, Sirius yelled after them. James turned around to shout back, no promises. Regulus kept on his path, not looking at James once, until they were sequestered in a secluded alcove of the library. Then, in an instant, he turned on him and pressed his back up against the bookshelves, lips hot and hungry and desperate, just how James liked them. Whatever will I do with the great James Potter all to myself all day? Regulus asked. His fingers were playing with the bottom of James' untucked shirt. Whatever you want, James said. He held up their connected wrist and reached out for Regulus's. He held it to his chest, then kissed it. He could have sworn he felt a surge of something pass between the tether or something. He shook his head in as much awe of Regulus as he always was. He repeated, whatever you want, and Regulus did just that. 5. James had taken to tracing along the wrist where Sirius's charmed string had rested for 12 glorious hours. Most of the time, he didn't even notice he was doing it until Remus had pointed it out to him. It was odd. When Sirius had counted the spell, he could have sworn he felt it deep in his chest. He knew that magic string wasn't indicative of his relationship with Regulus in any way, but it had felt tangible. Felt a tangled way to hold on to their love, and James had to admit that he missed it, even if all the love was still there. They sufficiently convinced Sirius that they were getting along, though, which was both good and bad. If he thought they hated each other, it was a lot easier to actually play pretend, especially because James lived on a bit of teasing banter, and Regulus was always really good, was always ready with a really good comeback or two. It was good, though, because Sirius had indeed invited Regulus to a party in the common room, and Regulus had shown up, and he and James could just relax and enjoy the night without worried about having to pretend to despise each other. The party was small, as far as party went, since exam season was looming, but there were still a fair few of them around to have a good time. The marauders were all present, of course, as were Lily, Mary, Malene, Dorcas, Regulus, and smattering other students from their year, and one below, and the one above. James was pleasantly buzzed on fire whiskey, lying on one of the couches. Marlene was attempting to paint his nails on one of his hands, but she was drunk as well, so he could only assume it was going horribly. Regulus kept looking over at him, pretending he wasn't. James knew this because he was doing the same. Remus' enchanted turntable was playing Fleetwood Mac, which meant that Lily was currently in charge of the music. James didn't mind. He liked the band, and their music was just the right tempo for his current state of drunkenness. Sirius stumbled over and lay down on top of James. "I'm bored." "How are you bored? We're having a party," James asked, and Sirius smushed his face into James's chest. Across the room, Regulus was gripping his cup tightly. James grinned. "Everyone is being boring," Sirius said. "What happened to dancing on tables?" "It's exam season," Dorcas answered, coming over to sit beside Marlene. "I think everyone's too tired to be interesting." Sirius booed, snuggling deeper into James's. James used his free hand to brush the hair away from his eyes. They were the exact opposite of Regulus's, a light, almost silvery gray, like starlight was shining out of them. "Why don't we play a game?" James suggested. Something flickered behind Sirius's gaze, and then he smiled and renewed exuberance. "That sounds like an excellent idea, Bronxy." He attempted to get up, instead falling off James on the floor. This did not temper his excitement. He hopped up and announced to the room, "Circle up, we're playing Truth or Dare." "I only finished one hand," Marlene whined, lifting James's hand up to her face to admire her handiwork. James followed her gaze and choked back a laugh. Well, he'd get Mary or Lily to fix it later." A group sat in a big circle in the middle of the room, and James sat with Sirius on one side, and Peter on the other side. Remus was beside Sirius, making eyes at James, who was discreetly making eyes at Regulus, who was directly across him, sandwiched between Dorcas and Benji Fenwick, a Ravenclaw from his year. "Who's starting?" Mary asked slyly, "because I have an excellent dare in hand." "Go on, then," Sirius prompted excitedly. She whispered something to Lily, who giggled, then turned her attention to Pete. "Pettigrew, Truth or Dare?" "Dare," Peter said, because he was a marauder, and marauders never picked truth in Truth or Dare. "I dare you to sweet-talk the fat lady. Bonus points if you convince her to go on a date with you," Mary said, eliciting many cheers from the group. Peter spluttered. I feel bad if she agrees. What am I supposed to do? Stand her up? What if she stops letting me into the common room?" Guess you'll have to find out, won't you? Mary said. Peter groaned as everyone started chanting his name, but stood up like a soldier on a mission. Everyone was deadly silent as he slipped out of the portrait hall, leaving it ajar so they could hear him. His attempts were laughably bad, and James shook with laughter as Peter finally took his shot and asked her out, and she shrieked loudly, so loudly that she woke up all nearby portraits. Peter's face was redder than the room's decor at the point of re-entry in the common room, and everyone was laughing ragiously. Not a word, he said miserably, and James patted him in sympathy on the shoulder as he sat back down. That's a true Gryffindor bravery, right there, James said, which made Peter look slightly less miserable. All right, Peter said eventually, voice more steady after the laughable subsided. He looked across the circle. Dearborn, truth or dare? Truth, Caradoc answered, and Peter requested knowing whether he'd ever had a sex dream about a professor. The answer, yes, but he refused to tell which of them was. James had his money on the fourth year defense against the dark arts professor. What a looker he'd been. A few more rounds pressed without incident. Emmeline Vance was dared to sing the Hogwarts school song backwards. Marlene admitted to shoving a Hufflepuff seeker off their broom in one of their Quidditch matches. Remus let Dorcas pierce her nose, and Lily was successfully snuck in and out of Slughorn's private quarters and stole a bottle of mead, passing it around vigorously. Lily turned her attention to Sirius. Truth or dare? She asked needlessly. He grinned. You know the answer for that, Evans. That I do, she said mischievously. It reminded James on why he had such a crush on her. She was always more of a mother than she pretended to be. I dare you to jog around the castle. Sirius stuttered. That's all? How tame. Naked, Lily added, which had surely been her plan all along. Everyone whooped and howled, expecting Sirius to be put off by the task. But James knew that this was the best dare Sirius could have asked for. He loved being the center of attention, even if he had to be naked to do it. He was always so incredibly conceited, and most definitely wanted them all to ogle how fit he was. Remus rolled his eyes as Sirius grinned and stood up, easily chucking off his shirt. He handed it to Remus, who held it to his heart in an exaggerated show of love. James saw Sirius shirtless and or naked quite often sharing a dorm, so he wasn't surprised in any way by the smattering tattoos that ran up and down his skin. Remus and Sirius had made up a spell to do them magically back in 5th year, and Sirius had probably gave himself a new one every day. He'd only gotten one of them the Muggle way, which James had also done, after Sirius had run away from home. James had a small paw print on his bicep, and Sirius had a pair of antlers on the back of his neck. Regulus clearly had not seen Sirius's tattoos, aside from the ones on his arm that were almost always visible with his rolled-up sleeves. Regulus had seen James's tattoo, of course, and had been a bit confused by the concept of getting a needle poked into your skin to draw a picture there permanently. James couldn't gauge the expression on his face at the moment, didn't know whether it was disdain or longing. Sirius was down to his briefs, which definitely belonged to Remus, and he asked Lily, take these off now, or once I'm outside? Outside, she said definitively. None of us need to be traumatized by the close-up view of your dick. Sirius smirked and opened his mouth, eyes drifting lazily to Remus, who tipped him who tripped him before he could say whatever god-awful sex jokes he'd been about to say. Sirius popped back up, albeit slower than usual, on the amount of alcohol, and muttered, "Killjoy." Everyone at the party followed Sirius out the door, sneaking through the corridors behind him until they split off so they could go to the astronomy tower to watch his jog. Since it had a prefect since it had a perfect 360 view of the grounds. A perfect 360 view of the grounds. Sirius saluted them all over his shoulder and went in the opposite direction. Regulus sidled up beside James, taking care to keep his face uninterested as he said, "I didn't know Sirius had so many tattoos." "Yeah," James said. There wasn't really anything more he could say about it. Regulus bit his lips, peeling away some of the skin there. It was a nervous habit of his, and he stopped once he noticed James noticing. "There's a lot," he continued, and James nodded, still unsure of what he was supposed to say. "I thought you said they hurt." "Oh." Was Regulus worried about Sirius? That was incredibly sweet. But James decided not to say that because he didn't want to get shoved off the astronomy tower. He reassured him. "The Mongol kind do, but he and Mooney made up some spell to do them magically ages ago. They don't hurt a bit." "Oh," Regulus said, then the wrinkle between his eyebrows softened. How do you know they don't?" James shrugged. "That's because they tell me. The girls have corroborated, except Lily, because she was Jewish." "You haven't done one?" Regulus asked. James raised his eyebrows. "You've seen every inch of my body. Don't you think you would know?" Regulus turned away from him, but James saw that blush of him creeping through. No one else noticed in the darkness, but James was well attuned to every little thing about him. James thought their conversation was over when Regulus asked, Do you think he'd teach me how to do it?" "You want tattoos?" Regulus shrugged. "There's something quite beautiful about turning your body into a work of art." "Your body is already a work of art," James whispered into his ear. He caught Lily's eyes and shifted away from Regulus, ignoring her smirk. "But I'm sure he'd be happy to teach you. It's one of his favorite things to do." "Other than Lupin," Regulus said, and James choked back a laugh. A burst of whooping cheers interrupted them, and they turned their attention to the ground, with all the others seeing the pale figure emerge from the darkness. "I can't even see his dick from all the way up here," someone complained loudly, and Regulus groaned, the only way a brother could. Sirius sprinted quickly, throwing a smile up to all of them on occasion. They all stayed mostly quiet, so as not to wake any of the professor or allow Filch and of their activities. James, though, thought there was a bit of a thin line between brilliantly courageous and brilliantly stupid, and that Sirius Black was the line. He also thought that was the best things about him. Sirius circled the castle twice, because of course he did, and everyone rushed from the tower once they saw him jogging back to the entrance of the castle to greet him as he reached the common room. He had his briefs back on and a windswept look on that probably wouldn't have worked on anyone else. But it did for him. Remus was clearly a fan, because he had a look about him that someone was extremely sexually frustrated. Sirius pulled him in for a brief kiss, and everyone shuffled back through the portrait hall, and they emerged through it looking much more satisfied. James could relate. He had been dying to kiss Regulus for an hour. A mere brush of their arms had set his entire body on fire. Sirius put his shirt and pants back on, grinning at James as he sat back down. "Prongs," he said. "Dare. Truth or dare?" Of, ugh. "Prongs," he said. "Dare." "Dare," James agreed. He grabbed the fire whiskey bottle and put it in the middle of the circle. "I dare you to spin the bottle. Whoever it lands on, you have to snog them for 30 seconds. With tongue." James glanced over at Regulus, whose body was stiff, then back at Sirius. "Okay, but I'm not going to make anyone kiss me." Sirius rolled his eyes. Fine. Can I get a yes from everyone in the circle who they consent to this dare?" Affirmation were muffled all around, and James groaned internally. Best case scenario, it landed on Remus, because Sirius probably wouldn't let that happen, even if it did. Regulus would know better than to get jealous about it. He reached forward and spun. Everyone was silent, tracking the motion. He couldn't help but wonder who was hoping it would land on them, and who was hoping it would land anywhere but them. It finally stopped spinning and... oh fuck. Regulus's spine got even straighter, if that was possible, and he opened his mouth, but nothing came out. James looked at Sirius, sure he would intervene and get it to spin again. He had a frown on his face, already looking at James, but shrugged in defeat. Rules are rules. Blimey, he must have been drunk his ass off. At least this meant that there was a possibility he'd forget about it in the morning. "Well, come on, little star," James said, clawing across the circle. Everyone looked incredibly stunned at this turn of events, barring the few who already knew about the two of them. Actually, scratch that. His friends who knew all looked incredibly stunned as well. Remus kept looking at Sirius out of the corner of his eye, like he was waiting for him to have a meltdown. "Don't call me that," Regulus said. It was what James had called him the first few years of knowing one another, before he and Sirius had stopped talking. "What would you rather I call you?" "I'd rather you not refer to me at all," Regulus said brightly. That was all James needed to lean in and kiss him. Regulus brought one of his hands up, gripping the front of James's shirt, and James clenched his hand at the side to stop him from cupping Regulus's face, as he tended to do. Kissing him was so easy that he lost track of time, and he knew that he probably would have been making more of a show of how annoying this was to him, but Regulus Black was the weakest spot, and he couldn't do any pretending otherwise. James didn't know if anyone was quiet if they kissed, or if they just felt that way because James had ascended to a plane of existence where they were the only two people on Earth. Sirius's voice brought them jarringly back to reality. "That's 30, he said, something in his tone that James couldn't pinpoint. James pulled back quickly, and James lingered. But Regulus lingered, his hand still on James's shirt. Someone coughed awkwardly, and Regulus dropped his hand, sinking it back into his place in the circle. James crawled back to stiffly to his own spot, avoiding Sirius's eye, because he was worried about what his own might give away. "That was kind of hot," Merlin whispered to Dorcas, who shushed her. The game ended shortly thereafter, and James was still refused to look Sirius in the eye. His affirmation was written all over him. He was sure of it, and he wanted Sirius to be too drunk to remember before he had to do damage control. Regulus avoided his eye for the rest of the night as well, except when he slipped off to his dorm with Dorcas, and he threw another glance back at James, eyes softening, a hint of a smile that he hid in his collar. James went to bed quickly, pretending to be asleep before he could field questions from Sirius or Peter, who had been hopelessly confused. Christ, that was close. +1. Sirius was going to lose his mind. He'd done everything he could possibly think of to get James and Regulus to admit they fancied one another, including making them kiss quite passionately, and still nothing. He didn't genuinely believe in lost causes, but he was coming to terms with the possibility that this might be one. Remus was no help, refusing to get involved with any of Sirius's plans. Something about it being immoral to meddle with his friends' love lives, as if all of their friends hadn't meddled in theirs a time or two. He'd known something was different for a while now. James often got dazed look in his eyes, but Sirius had quickly noticed that he was no longer looking at Lily, but at the Slytherin table. The only Slytherins they were on good terms with were Dorcas and Regulus, and Sirius had grudgingly admitted to himself that one option was more likely than the other. He wasn't totally thrilled about the prospect of James fancying his brother, but he couldn't have Sirius and Regulus. Regulus was the next best option. He'd written it off at first, though, because James Potter could fall in love with a doorknob if you let him, and he'd gone about his business, sure it would amount to nothing more than a week-long crush. It was a month later, and he realized the crush may not have been one-sided. Regulus and Sirius had been spending the day together, trying to get back to being something more than what they'd allowed themselves to become over the last few years. Sirius hadn't been open to it at all at first, but they'd had a long talk over the holidays, and while Sirius disagreed with Regulus' view on how running away had gone, he could acknowledge that Regulus hadn't wanted him to go, and that he hadn't really hated him, but envied him for being the person he thought he'd never be. Sirius understood this feeling quite well, because he'd felt the exact same about Regulus as long as he could remember. Regulus had spent practically the entire day trying to convince Sirius to sneak into Gryffindor Quidditch practice to spy on them. Regulus, bless his heart, had definitely thought he was being discreet about it, but he very much was not. Sirius finally gave in because it was just one practice anyway, and it had quickly become clear that Regulus had not wanted to spy at all, but watch James. Sirius had never seen his brother looking wistful and or infatuated, and it was quite the shock to his system. He'd been so surprised, in fact, that he hadn't brought it up at all, not even to make a joke of it. He had screamed about it to Remus, unsure what to do with the fact that his best friend fancied his brother and that his brother fancied his best friend back. When had they even had the time to decide to fancy one another? Remus had suggested taking a sedative and leaving it alone, but Sirius would do no such thing. At first, he'd been completely against it. Not only would Regulus steal James from him, but James would also be stealing Regulus, and James had only just gotten him back. Months down the line, he'd been worn down, slimly from excessive hopeful and desperate looks the two of them shot each other when they thought no one was looking, or the casual touches they thought no one could see. James never smiled around anyone like he smiled around Regulus. He smiled around everyone. And Sirius had been convinced Regulus would turn permanently pink for how often he blushed when James was around. Feeling very much like the creator of his own demise, Sirius had henceforth decided his time was convincing the two of them to admit their bloody feelings or die trying. All of their other friends were convinced James had a secret lover, but Sirius knew that wasn't true, because he would have been obnoxious about it. Even if he'd been trying to keep it a secret, James Potter didn't do anything halfway, especially not love. When he found James as a stag in the Quidditch changing room next to a shirtless Regulus, he'd been sure one of them had been on the verge of making a move, but James had said he'd meant it as a prank. Merlin hadn't known Regulus would be there. Uh, uh, but James had said he'd meant to prank Marlene and hadn't known Regulus would be there. He seemed embarrassed by the mishap, so Sirius was inclined to believe him, especially because James was a rotten liar at the best of times. Then James used studying as an excuse to get out of going to Hogsmeade with Peter and the girls, but when Sirius and Remus had arrived back in the dorm earlier than expected, James had just been napping. A whole day, free to go confess his feelings, and what did he do? Sleep. The bloody idiot. Sirius still didn't know what to make of James coming to class in a Slytherin tie-on. His best guess was that he would have been trying to impress Regulus or something, but Sirius had kept an eye on Regulus that night at dinner, and he hadn't seemed to notice James at all. Maybe that was when they'd gotten into a fight that had James chucking a quaffle at him in the cup final. How the two of them couldn't realize their banter sounded more like flirter than actual insult was beyond him. Neither of them had thought anything of the spell to bind each other, either. Remus had chided him for it, saying it was too obvious, but James and Regulus hadn't even blinked, totally oblivious. It wasn't a common enchantment, sure, but they had to have heard of the red string of fate, tying you to the object of your affection. It had been all the rage when they were in third year, and James had even made a joke at the time about tying himself to Evans. Only thing was, it didn't work unless the feelings were mutual, and it had worked for James and Regulus. He'd been lost after, unsure on what else to do to get their heads out of their asses. When the perfect idea struck on his naked jog around the castle, he thought he'd struck gold, enchanting the bottle in truth or dare to make them kiss, but neither of them had so much spoken in the weeks following, and they had both pretended to be too drunk to remember what happened. Now, he was infuriated by their stupidity, and if they wouldn't get their shit together in their own terms, he'd bloody force them to. All three of them stood in the potions classroom, a large cauldron on the table with Sirius standing beside it, and James and Regulus standing warily in front of him. The distance between the two of them was too tense and careful, and Sirius took that as confirmation that they did indeed remember their kiss at the party. James rubbed his wrist, looking at Regulus, then at Sirius. What are we doing here? James, Reg, you're both the best at potions in the year. Evans is much better than me, James interrupted. I'm not even in your year, Regulus added. Sirius carried on, unperturbed. I just need you to tell me what if it smells right. I've been going crazy for days, and if I don't nail this, Slughorn will finally kick me out of his class. Not true, even if with their parents in Azkaban and Sirius' disinheritance, Slughorn was still intent on kissing his ass. So please, help a pal out. What's it supposed to smell like? James asked. Just tell me what it smells like for you, and I'll tell you if it's right or not. I don't want to bias you. If nothing else worked, Amortentia would have to do the trick. He'd enlisted Lily's help in brewing it, because she was the best, and she hadn't even asked what it was for, thank Merlin. He'd known he was growing on her, but he thought they might actually be friends now. Regulus and James both stepped up to the cauldron warily, like this was a test. They probably expected this to be enchanted to blow up in their faces, which was a classic move, but not his current goal. "Can't bloody smell anything," James said. He threw his look at Regulus. "Your perfume is clogging up my nostrils." Regulus scoffed and narrowed his eyes. "I don't wear perfume, and you know it. However, I will not apologize for using hair care products, because some of us actually enjoy making an effort, better than smelling like sweat and broomstick, which you no doubt came straight off from making love to." James sniffed himself indignantly. "I do not smell like sweat. I smell like peaches and loveliness. Sirius's potions smells like peaches, not you." "No, it smells like all minty like those leaves you chew on," James shot back. Sirius didn't bother asking how James knew Regulus chewed on mint leaves. People with crushes were entirely off their rocker. He could say this because his crush on Remus had been extreme, even by his standards. Regulus narrowed his eyes. "What potion is this supposed to be anyway?" he asked Sirius. "I can't really help if I don't know what you're brewing." Sirius smirked. "Amortentia." It was almost comical, how color drained from both of their faces simultaneously. They took a nervous step apart, and James immediately began stuttering. "Oh, that's how it smells like lilies, then, like Lily and Evans, who I love." "You haven't loved her since fourth year, Bronx," Sirius said. He had never seen James look so panicked. "Listen," Regulus blurted, his face blank as he usually was, but his dark eyes were wide, the only giveaway that he was as uneasy as James was. "I can explain. It was my fault. I was the one who kissed him." "No, you weren't," Sirius said with a laugh. "We were all there. James kissed you." Regulus looked confused. "What? You were there?" "He means during the party, Reggie," James said. Sirius lifted his eyebrows. "Reggie, huh?" Then his brain backtracked to what Regulus had said. "Wait, when are you talking about?" "The party," Regulus said. "James?" Sirius asked, because James couldn't tell a damn lie to save his life. "Holidays," James said quietly. "What was that?" "Holidays," he muttered again, a bit louder. Regulus shut his eyes like he'd seen his fate and was evading the final blow. But see, now Sirius was confused, because what holidays were they talking about? Regulus had kissed James during the holidays, and neither of one of them had mentioned it. "You kissed James during the holidays." I kissed him back, to be fair," James said. Regulus banged his head on the table beside him. Sirius threw his hands up in the air. "Well, then why the bloody hell have you two been dancing around each other for months if you've never had a crush before? Surely a reciprocated kiss means something." Regulus blinked and opened his eyes. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about how you and Prongs are ridiculous crushes on each other. It's been obvious for months, and I keep trying to get you two to confess your feelings for each other, even charmed you two with a bloody red string of fate to make you snog, and you're still too dumb to get it," Sirius exclaimed. James and Regulus blinked at Sirius, then at each other. The corner of James's eyes quirked up like he was about to laugh, and Regulus groaned, shaking his head. "Jamie, no, don't. I've been dating Regulus since winter holidays. He kissed me, I kissed him back, then we spent days being ridiculous about it, and then we kissed some more, and then I asked him to go on a date with me. Once we got back to school, we did. We decided to make a relationship official, and we've been together ever since," James explained. Sirius's mouth dropped open. No, he was lying. But James was such a bad liar. He turned to his brother. Regulus shrugged, defeated. "I'm not sorry about it. You don't own him. Bloody hell. Sirius exhaled. Are you fucking kidding me? I've been spending so much time trying to get you two together, and you're already together. Does everyone know except me? Why didn't you tell me? We thought you'd be angry, Regulus said, and I didn't want to lose you again. Fucking. Sirius ran a hasty hand through his hair and then opened his arm. Come here. Regulus glanced at James, ignoring Sirius's arms. Sirius sighed. Come here, you little asshole. Give me a hug. He didn't wait for Regulus this time. He just pulled the arm and folded. He just pulled him by one arm and folded him into his chest. You won't ever lose me again, he said softly to Regulus's shoulder. I promise. Some of the tension in Regulus' body left as he hugged Sirius back, a bit awkwardly. They weren't used to doing this. I'm sorry for not telling you. It's okay. I understand why you didn't. He did, even if he was a bit fucking pissed about it. He let Regulus go and held him by his shoulders. Regulus was ruefully an inch taller than him, and aggravated Sirius to no end. He brushed Sirius's hair behind his ears. When had it gotten that long? And smiled at him. Are you happy? Regulus peeked at James out of the corner of his eyes, going brilliantly red. Yeah, I am. Sirius turned to James, opened his arms for a hug. Sirius crossed his arms. My fucking brother. James wiggled his fingers, inviting Sirius in. You're gonna give me this talk and not him? We tell each other everything, Sirius said. I did tell you, James said. Eventually. Sirius sighed. You love him, don't you? I'm right here, Regulus said. Of course I do, more than anything, James said, not missing a beat. Oh, bloody hell, repeated, stepping forward and letting James hug the life out of him. You two are going to be insufferable now, aren't you? Sirius asked, once James released him. Have you met yourself in Remus? Regulus asked. Touché. Have you really been trying to get to set us up? James asked. Sirius huffed out a breathless laugh. Like you wouldn't believe. I'm driving Mooney insane. He thinks you two are a lost cause. Regulus laughed, and James and Sirius both raised their brows on him. Sorry, Regulus said. Just, he knows about us. Sirius's jaw dropped for the second time that day. And he didn't tell me? He's a good friend, James said with a shrug. I'm going to kick his ass, Sirius decided, strutting from the classroom. James and Regulus didn't follow behind him, and Sirius knew exactly why. They were all stupid beyond measure, weren't they? He found Remus in the library with Lily. You bloody knew? He asked with no preamble. Hello, Podfic. How was your day? Mine was all right. Lils and I were just finishing up our transfiguration work, Remus said, not even looking up from his apartment. Lily snickers to herself. Remus glanced up through his lashes. To answer your question, yes. Why didn't I tell you? None of my business to tell. How'd you find out? Are you talking about James and Regulus? Lily asked. Sirius scoffed in exasperation. She knows too. Not by choice, she said. How'd you find out? Remus asked again, finally setting his work aside. Sirius plopped himself down the table, folding his hands on top of it. So I brewed some Amortentia, right? Lily coughed, and he amended. I decided to brew some Amortentia, and Evans did all the heavy lifting because she's the best, and then I asked him to smell it without telling them what it was at first, to get them to finally admit that they fancied each other. Then, when I finally revealed the nature of the potion, Rickett all panicked and said he was the one who kissed James over the holidays, and I'm like, the holidays? You kissed him you kissed him way back then and still haven't got your shit together. And then Prong said, we've been dating for months, you dimwit. And I debated strangling them both, but instead gave them hugs. And then Reg told me you knew about it, so I came here. Did Potter actually call you dimwit? Lily asked. No, of course not, Sirius said. What did Potter do? What did Potter do? James asked, strolling into the library with the biggest grin Sirius had ever seen. Regulus was beside him, their hands tangled together, and though it appeared Regulus was doing his best to look like he'd wandered in completely separate from James. Whoa, good with the PDA, Lily said, shielding her eyes. James took it as a challenge, leaned in to give Regulus a short peck on the lips. Regulus was fighting a smile so hard it almost looked painful, but Sirius had always known that James would do this smiling for both of them. Still glad they sorted their shit out, Remus teased quietly, as they sat down at the table with them and engaged Lily in conversation. Sirius watched them, his brother and his best friend, and felt happiness and love radiating off the two of them, and decided definitively, yeah, I am. Hi, thank you for watching this video. This was a long one, and my throat definitely hurts right now, so I'm just gonna keep this short. Thank you for watching. I hope you had a good time listening to this. This is a great fic. As always, as I did the last few times, I will put the link in the description so you can check it out, and leave kudos to this incredibly amazing writer. Thank you for watching. Have a nice day.